Good afternoon. First of all, let me say how honored and pleased I am to be here. Second, of course, given the number of presentations I was able to witness today, I'm truly humbled. And more importantly, I want to thank Linda for her dogged persistence, insistence, and all the harassment she gave my staff to say you had to come. This was not on my schedule, but as folks keep telling me why it was important for me to be here, without much debate, I said, by all means, I'll change my schedule to come to be here. As you know, Canada has always had a very shameful history in regard to its role in the asbestos struggle. For decades, we have been exporting asbestos throughout the world, and for the most part, we have ignored, of course, the dangers and what asbestos will be doing to other human beings around the world. At the same time, we have, of course, imported the product in our own country. Canada used to produce at one time 40% of the world chrysotile asbestos, and that's not so long ago. We also have had, of course, the same denial with researchers, McGill University, who have done research on chrysotile asbestos and said it's not the same, it's not going to impact you, only to learn many years later, of course, the studies that they produced was paid for by the same industry, was perpetuating the crime against working people throughout the world. Canada, of course, mined asbestos for local markets and, of course, later expanded it worldwide. And that meant there was a lot of political issues relating to the ban on asbestos. The place where asbestos was mined in Canada, the town was called Asbestos, and to speak volumes about the symbolic importance to the industry. One of the important issue, because it was in Quebec, that the labor movement in Quebec played a significant role, of course, in evolving the labor movement into, of course, the challenges the workers were faced with. And of course, workers were always reluctant to call for the ban and the shutting down of the industry because of what those workers had paid historically in the struggle for workers in that province. Of course, it also led to the Quiet Revolution. As you know, back in the late 50s, 60s, and 70s, the church played an important role in Quebec history. It was through the workers' strike and resistance that the church eventually was, of course, marginalized, and of course, what was called a quiet revolution in Quebec took place. So there was always a sense that we had to be careful. So why did the ban became a priority? This is both an interesting story, and we have been, since the 1960s in the Canadian Labour Congress, trying to get our movement to come together to call for a ban, and there's always been division in the movement, of course. The unions that were mining the substance, of course, didn't want to agree. And in addition to that, of course, we didn't want to divide our movement. The statistics on asbestos death in Canada is about 2,000 Canadians that died as a result of asbestos exposures in the past in our country every single day. And of course, since 2000 to 2012, that has increased some 60% in Canada. Of course, the latency period is which we're all seeing. We know, of course, the history of what the WHO have told us about some 100,000 related deaths are happening around the world. Asbestos, of course, import also in Canada, with the number of products that we still import in Canada have risen significantly. And so how did we came about the ban? Of course, as many of you are aware, in 2015 we had an important election in our country, and we defeated the most right-wing ideological government we'd seen in Canada that ruled the country for some 10 years. It's a little bit like Donald Trump. The Prime Minister did not believe in science or science-based decision, and more importantly, anything had to do with asbestos, he was absolutely opposed to. As a matter of fact, the seat in which the member of parliament that stood in the House of Commons actually came from his political party, and during the election, the Prime Minister actually traveled to that riding to say he will continue to support the industry because how important it was for jobs. Of course, there wasn't many jobs associated with the industry anymore, but it was just shameful politics because it had to do, of course, with his members getting re-elected. Of course, the last asbestos mine in Canada, that mine finally closed in 2012, so it made it quite possible for us to push the envelope. That opened the door for us, of course, to get the federal government to finally do something. And of course, with the new government getting elected, and basically said, the Prime Minister said, they believe in science-based decisions. Once they said that, it was easy for us to hold their feet to the fire and remind them science-based decision on asbestos was long past the due date, because the asbestos we were producing in our country, including the asbestos we were importing into our country, will kill you. Of course, we began a campaign, of course, in 2006, and it had many different iterations. In 2000, of course, 16 in February, we had a major lobby on the Hill. Every year we have a lobby. We identify the 2 or 3 issues we are going to take on and not here in our political campaign as a Congress, and of course put a lot of efforts. I have to tell you the truth, asbestos was not on the list. We had just got some major changes to the unemployment insurance system in our country, and as a result of that, we figured we're going to go in a lobby, and given that we just had these changes that made it significantly better for our members who were being laid off and of course losing their jobs, maybe we should add something else to the list as a top priority. I was traveling, so I called our staff and suggested to them that we need to take unemployment insurance off the list and add asbestos. You could have heard the phone on the other side. They said, "Are you mad? How are we going to put asbestos on the list?" And it's 2 weeks before the lobby. I says, we already have the materials been produced. We've been using them, of course, in many different aspects. All we have to do is people need to get in their office and rewrite the material and have it ready, because we are going to have asbestos on the list. We had 2 additional issues: Canada Pension Plan, which we were fighting to expand the Canada Pension Plan, a campaign we've had for 8 years. And of course, we were working also to stop the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Once we had over close to 300 members showed up for the lobby, the reception was quite phenomenal on the Hill among members of Parliament, and exactly what was said in many panels here before. You mean asbestos is not banned? We still use this as a substance in our country? It gave us, of course, even more commitment that we had to push harder. Our Prime Minister was speaking at one of our Building Trades conference, so of course we asked one of our members who was at the conference to get up and ask him a question. And basically the question was very simple. He got up and asked the Prime Minister a question. He said, "Do you support the ban of asbestos?" Of course, the Prime Minister says, "I absolutely do." The green light, of course, took place, and more importantly, we had to hold him to his word. The science, of course, could not be ignored anymore in the country, and more importantly, things began to move very quickly. We held a press conference very shortly. From our perspective, this country had to complete this in a very short time. We brought individuals who have been victims of asbestos, as been told here today, families who are dying of asbestos. And more importantly, we shared the statistical evidence and how many Canadians were dying in the country as a result of the fact that we had not banned this substance. The challenge we had, of course, there was 4 departments that were responsible for this issue in the government. We couldn't get the government to identify which minister was going to take the lead on the ban of asbestos. They were fiddling for months on end. Finally, I went to the Prime Minister's office and said, "I'm sick and tired of the bullshit that's going on. And I don't really care who is responsible. So long as you tell me who it is, I'll deal with the rest of it." They finally said it was the Minister of Science. Christy Duncan is a wonderful woman, very thoughtful, very kind, of course. She was a teacher in her past life, and now, of course, she's the Minister of Science. I did go to see her. She's very nervous, thinking I was going to get really mad at her. I said, "Listen, I'm not here to get mad at you. But I want to tell you one simple thing. From now until the House rises, which is in December, you must, of course, make a public announcement that you are going to ban the import of asbestos in our country. And I expect nothing less." Of course, the House rose on December the 15th of December. Just happened to be my birthday. I usually don't work on my birthday for any reasons. On this December 15th, which is in 2016, I made an exception. 4 ministers of the government, the Minister of Health, the Minister of Science, the Minister of Public Works, and the Minister of the Environment, both showed up to a press conference with myself to talk about the fact that our government, for the first time in its history, will ban both the import and exports of asbestos. We've also asked them to do something else in the process. We said we also want the government to create a public registry for all federal buildings that was leased or owned that is known to have asbestos, and the workers who work in those facilities will have it posted so they will fully be aware. They would have, of course, air monitoring regular those facilities and continue, of course, to pay attention to ensure no workers were duly exposed. In addition to that, we wanted the government to federally to lower the threshold value in terms of workers' exposure to asbestos. And more importantly, of course, we want Canada to finally sign on to the Rotterdam Convention. For decades, we spent opposing our signature to the Rotterdam Convention. And of course, I said to these ministers that was at the press conference, if you should be able to do that, it will be a major accomplishment for our country and more importantly for workers in our country. On December the 15th in 2016, of course, the government did, of course, announce the ban. We also got something else. In a lot of the rebuilding of course, the infrastructure in our country, of course, materials are being used. We know for a fact, we have documented the cement pipes made with asbestos are still being used, of course, in the retrofit and rebuilding of the country. We got the government to also announce they will no longer permit any asbestos material to be used in any of the infrastructure rebuilding that's taking place in the country that they were funding as a government. So we recognize, very importantly, this work's never stopped. That was only an important part of the work. And of course, we had to move even farther. Lowering the threshold value that workers are exposed to was an important part of that work. Well, of course, public spaces that we hope the workers are working in federally will continue to be much safer going forward. And this ban will have an impact internationally, hopefully giving, of course, some impetus to the efforts that many in this room have been fighting. But we know our work is not done. We are proud, of course, the work we did in achieving the ban. However, there's still much to be done at the provincial level. We are a federated country. While the federal government have a right to, of course, regulate within its jurisdiction, it does not have the right to tell the provincial government what they must do in their jurisdiction. So now we've turned our effort at the provincial level. We want, of course, the provincial government to bring in similar legislation, of course, that would list all public buildings that has asbestos in them. And I'm hoping as a result of what we have done recently in our country will make a difference. The number of Canadians that are dying of asbestos-related disease would not stop anytime soon because, of course, the latency period has continued to come into fruition. But I'm hoping, of course, what we were able to do in a very short time and a long history of workers fighting in our country can give some hope and support to the greater effort around the world. We did make a video, of course, to publicize the work that we are doing, and it really is about telling the stories, of course, loved ones who have lost their family. The video is only about 1.5 minutes. It's very short, but it tells the story, of course, innocently how workers are exposed to this substance, and more importantly, when they die. It's been dedicated to Clem Cote, who was a worker, a unionized worker who died. His daughter was at the press conference when we announced the ban. It was her last dying wish of her father.
Just have to hold on tight, baby, I am not leaving. I want to keep you by my side. I wanna go where the sun embraces tonight. I want to keep you by my side. We'll find a way, gazing at the light in the sky.